Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've covered a lot of ground toward the Puritan development of a strong economy. It was not quick. It was not easy. What we've looked at so far was the first triangle trade route between New England, Africa, and England. Then we talked about the wampum economy and fur. These short-lived commercial exercises were pivotal for the fledgling Puritan colonies in New England, and they helped to develop skills and contacts that would prove most beneficial moving forward. The idea for the next few weeks is to develop a real working model of what their economy became. We'll stretch into the future with some of the narrative well into the 18th century and back again to the 17th. The goal is to develop their commercial enterprises to such an extent that when we mention them in future episodes, we won't have to always fully develop the political economy, but rather tell the story that it provoked. Now, that said, we want to develop several subjects or topics together. They really need to be understood as a larger, cohesive narrative. And if you remember, there are two primary goals to the podcast, History Comes Alive. Can you remember those? The first one is how the 13 colonies managed to unite to gain their independence from England. And secondly, we want to understand what role the natives played in that saga. So we need to stay focused on the primary objectives so that we stay true to the narrative. We want to make sure that we emphasize the important things to accomplish the bigger picture. If, for example, the theme of this podcast was colonial medicine and health, much of what we've discussed, almost all of it in this podcast series, would not add much to that conversation, even if what we had said was true. And you understand that? I mean, I do have a book on Puritan health and medicine, but it doesn't do much good for our narrative for this podcast. Do you understand that? I say this today specifically because this is one of those episodes, or one of a few, the first for a few weeks, where we'll begin to talk about slavery in the colonies. But this is not a podcast about slavery, and so it's going to be addressed as part of the narrative. The goal here right now in this particular time frame is not to dedicate weeks and weeks to the horrors of slavery in the Americas, and it was horrible. Perhaps a better time, or at least in my mind, a better time for this particular podcast to really do a deep dive into slavery is about the time of the American Revolution. There were Africans that fought on both sides, like natives. In fact, there were a lot of opposing positions by the time of the Revolution. I mean, frankly, one of the first casualties was a former slave named Crispus Attucks, an active participant of a threatening mob during what would become known as the Boston Massacre. There were discussions, debates, and considerations around slavery during those years between the Founding Fathers that rarely received the public attention they deserve. And maybe another series at the time of the Civil War. Perhaps a broader conversation could even be had from the Civil War to the present. I don't know. Slavery and race relations are huge topics. And I just don't feel at this point in the podcast we've covered enough or have enough material to keep us with the narrative without going too far ahead. So down the road, that is the plan. If anyone's waiting for the slavery conversation or, thinking ahead a little bit and wondering how we're going to be handling this, I do feel like it's a sad commentary of our day that some of these hot button issues seem to be always pushed to the forefront of every conversation. We live in a time where one's legitimacy is often measured by a single siloed topic, where they stand on that one pet issue that someone holds. I mean, their pedigree must be nearly perfect. Their conversation exactly what the hearer wants. The hearer, not the listener. Someone just hearing the noise of another person's mouth. And that's sad. It's divisive and it's unproductive. Slavery, the form that developed during the days of European colonialism and mercantilism, is a stain on history. But like everything else, it must be viewed in context. It's well documented, just as it is still in many parts of the world. We have a long way to go when it comes to race relations. But again, in context, there are many regions around the world that struggle more than here. Do your homework. More to the business of our day might be the current crime wave that we're living through, especially in our inner cities. or corruption in government. These present clear and present dangers for us all. Incompetence on a level that threatens everybody. So I'm not diminishing the horror. I am going to try to keep it in historical context. If you have a good diet of information, you quickly realize that there are some who focus only on negative things, the shameful history, while others seem to ignore it completely. Either they seem to have a disproportional axe to grind or are uncomfortable talking about it at all. Neither position represents the historical context. And I think it's easier to gravitate to one end or the other of the spectrum from within the culture, myopically, especially in today's divided climate, than to compare and contrast with other cultures and times. It's tough to name a piece of land currently occupied anywhere in the world that was not once somebody else's. I'm talking from a cultural, a societal, a national standpoint. And most people groups don't go willingly. America, for all of its warts, past and present, is a major destination for the world's immigrants today. And that says something. Anyway, my long-term goal is to, at some point, do a deeper dive into the whole subject, the history, the subcultures, maybe have some guests on from different backgrounds and perspectives to work through the various points, but that's for another time. For now, we'll hit on some of the historical realities. Frankly, I hope I haven't muddied the waters on this already. I just wanted to say something ahead of time because I have had a few people reach out and ask if I'd cover slavery or when I was going to do that. I don't want you to be disappointed. So these days, if you're thinking it all about race, it feels like you can't win anyways, right? I think most people feel that way. The conversation has been hijacked by the extremes. It's like you have to pick a side. So we'll just throw the narrative out there as it developed in the colonies. And one more thing, remember, when we go through this, especially in these initial decades or the initial century and a half, colonial America was not America. It was England, Britain, the United Kingdom, however you want to look at that. But it wasn't America as it would one day be constituted, and it certainly wasn't the America that we have today. I like to think that we've done a good job here at History Comes Alive of maintaining honesty and integrity to the historical narrative, just like when we handled the Pequot War. I wasn't very generous to the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay. They didn't deserve generosity on that topic. And so, too, when it comes to the abomination of American slavery, we want to be honest, but it can't be allowed to take over this podcast. The central theme that we're driving for is colonial unity and the native role. Popular history omits depth on a lot of topics because the goal there is to present a basic understanding of where we are, where our culture is, or where we came from in the context of the larger world around us. It provides an identity through common experience. Our goal is deeper, but with a targeted, specific purpose: the colonial political economic system. From these next few episodes, we'll take another look at the relations between the Dutch and the English, the native activity, the Puritan involvement with the regicides, the colonial fallout from the Restoration, the French and frontier wars, and on it goes. Those subjects I just mentioned are going to take us a while. So again, the podcast is driving toward the revolution. Slavery and the slave economies, and that's right, economies, plural, were only a piece of that narrative. So when we talk about the evolution of a viable New England economy, we have to also develop and consider three other regions. They were all very interdependent. The various Caribbean islands, occupied by all the major European players of the day, Spain, France, the Netherlands, England. The larger area stretched all the way to Brazil. And there was Africa, and there was England. And along the way, we'll talk a bit about the middle and southern colonies as well. And those will be direct relations to the slave industry. But we're developing New England right now, so the bulk of our development of the middle and southern colonies along that eastern seaboard of the continental United States today will come in much later episodes. At any rate, we'll at least begin to create an outline of what they looked like. Each of these regions were unique in what they offered. So let's think about what each one had to offer before we get started. Well, before that, the first three things to consider at this time frame are that the American colonies were quickly expanding and finding their own identities. They were English, but competing. They competed for political ideas, religious doctrine, economics. So they needed each other, but each area was pretty self-absorbed. Secondly, the farther north you traveled, the less the soil and climate supported large-scale farming. And conversely, the farther south, the more the soil and climate supported large-scale farming. There was a uniqueness even in this respect. In short, the Caribbean West Indies produced sugar and molasses. The Carolinas and Virginia produced indigo, rice, cotton, tobacco, and wool. New England produced foodstuffs, fish, whale and whale oil, whale products, ships, livestock, maple sugar, and then there's the biggies, rum, whiskey, and beer. And rum was huge. England took in the raw materials and turned out finished goods for everybody else. Africa's contribution was people, slaves. Those are the parameters that we want to work with. The colonies did produce more things than I mentioned regionally, but those commodities listed were a good start. We'll talk more about specifics as the need arises. So as we mentioned the last few weeks, New England struggled to find their stride with a stable economy for quite a few years. As the wampum and the fur industries began to run their course, they really needed to find another avenue for economic growth and stability. They did have connections with other regions. These connections were not just English, they were Puritan. In fact, many of the Puritans involved in New England were also hedging their bets in the islands of the Caribbean and West Indies. Some of our old friends from Saybrook, the Earl of Warwick, Lord Brooke, and Viscount Say and Seal, were financing colonies as far as Providence Island in the Spanish Caribbean. Saybrook was short-lived, but it literally did not fit their template anyway. If you recall, these guys were like the anti-Puritans, Ferdinand Gorges and Governor John Mason. Remember, it's Governor John Mason, not Captain John Mason of the Pequot War, Governor John Mason of New Hampshire. Anyways, their focus for economic development was more along the lines of European feudalism. And by their focus for economic development was more along the lines of European feudalism, I'm talking about not just Ferdinand Gorges and John Mason, but the Puritans as well. And there were a lot of Puritans of names that we do recognize. Oliver Cromwell had planned to immigrate to these colonies. But then the Civil War broke out and his life took a very different path. Anyway, these were to be business enterprises as much as anything else. So there were connections between the two regions. The southern regions would support the vision, almost, of, feudalism, but they needed workers. And at that time, there were two primary types or classes of cheap mass labor. Indentured servants, people, mostly men, who would travel to a colony and commit to working for a number of years before obtaining their freedom. And slaves, people, generally men, who had no future promise of freedom. Their servitude was in perpetuity. The advent of large-scale slavery was slow to build. For example, in Maryland, until the 1680s, a plantation would more than likely be worked by indentured servants and not African slaves. As I think about slavery, its early development, it seems really odd that it got a foothold at all. It seems like it was inevitable based on the goals of certain colonists, but these same men came to America for their freedom, for the opportunity to exercise explicit rights. And then they turned around and stole an entire population and denied them those same dreams. Anyways, don't misunderstand. Slavery wasn't an afterthought. They came with an acceptance of slavery. It was already a thing, right? It had been for a while. And there were labor shortages. Remember, the Pequots were not only absorbed into other nations, as well as Puritan society as slaves, but also shipped to the Caribbean. And that's a point that we're going to develop further in just a little bit. There were differences in conduct and convictions about slavery among the Europeans. It wasn't all just, one size fits all. In a general sense, those differences can be delineated between Catholic and Protestant lines. But the edges do get blurry. The Rhode Island of Roger Williams's day looked different than the Rhode Island a few decades later. The Catholics, mainly the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese, although there were English as well, looked at the slaves as potential converts. They were people with rights. Slaves, yes, but human. The Protestants, mainly the Dutch and the English, did not see the slaves as potential converts. They recognized slavery from the Old Testament as they interpreted it. And slaves were property, along the same lines as cattle or other livestock. Not all. I mean, remember Matthew and Thomas Mayhew on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. I mean, they spent their lives as missionaries to the natives, never enslaving anyone. I mean, there may have been a little strong-arming going on once in a while or manipulation, but no slavery. Anyway, as large-scale farming took root, and excuse the pun, farming that took root, indentured servitude lost its popularity. I mean, it all came down to money. An indentured servant came with a cost of 2 to 4 pounds annually. And then, after a time, they left. Slaves came with an upfront cost of somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 30 pounds at purchase. But then they stayed, and their productivity paid for their investment over time. Plus, they may actually produce children, another generation of workers. I mean, it's a pretty cold and sterile outlook, just like livestock, wouldn't you say? It's kind of an interesting thing if you compare the differing contemporary slave markets of the 17th century. So, for instance, in Africa, it was Africans selling Africans. I mean, sometimes selling them for cowrie shells, which is a form of shell money, much like wampum, but with a much larger geographic appeal and a recognized relationship to gold and silver. Then later, New England rum would be a big commodity, and guns. It was mostly the men that were shipped off, just like in New England. Now, if New England had followed that model, it would have been the larger native groups like the Pequots and the Narragansetts that ran the native slave market, delivering slaves from the interior of the continent. But early on, Massachusetts Bay had taken over completely. In Africa, the Europeans didn't. The initial charter stated for Massachusetts Bay, if you remember, I think we quoted this a few weeks ago, they were to take part in such activities as, quote, planting, ruling, order, and governing of New England and America, and to their successors and assignees forever, end quote. So they had permission. Although Charles I and Charles II later at the Restoration did not approve of unnecessarily abusing the natives. Remember, we mentioned this before, and we'll talk about it again. Charles II was really interested in the Narragansetts when he heard that they had pledged their allegiance to his throne. Anyways, once the Puritans decided that they could abuse the natives, slavery was not too far away. I mean, if you can justify abusing one group, it's not too hard to justify abusing another. It's merely a matter of degrees or interest or ability or opportunity, isn't it? So if you remember, there had been a great migration of Puritans to and through Massachusetts Bay all through the 1630s. It was that population explosion that had given Massachusetts Bay the edge in New England. But that was not the only area that saw massive Puritan numbers arriving. Between the years of 1612 and 1646, 40,000 Puritans settled all over the West Indies, eclipsing even Massachusetts Bay. The initial English contact in the Caribbean was Bermuda, over the winter between 1609 and 1610. Sir Thomas Gates's ship was wrecked as he was on his way to Virginia with more colonists for Jamestown. So he and his crew wintered there on Bermuda, and they managed to build 2 boats, which I find pretty impressive in and of itself. The boats were seaworthy enough to take them all the way to Jamestown. So again, there is some skill and resiliency in these men. But of the island colonies and plantations, Barbados would soon be the largest and most important. Kind of the southern Boston, but more so. When the first English arrived in 1627, it was uninhabited. It would become the sugar capital. The potential was realized very early on. In 1628, Henry Winthrop, another son of Governor John Winthrop, was one of the first settlers, and he tried to grow tobacco, but the quality was very poor. And cotton would later fail as well. So as a side note, the mass population growth slowed as the Civil War picked up steam in England. So you remember we talked about this with Massachusetts Bay, and frankly, all of New England really. But what would the Civil War have looked like in England if all of these well-to-do, industrious, like-minded Puritans had never left England? I mean, you're not just talking about the 30,000 that poured into New England. Now you're talking about another 40,000 in the West Indies and the Caribbean. I mean, the whole world might look very different today. Think about that. That's huge. Like, that's one of those, you could have a revisionist history series of books or something on what that would have looked like. Anyways, I always find that fascinating. But it was the Civil War that really kickstarted the Barbados sugar economy. I mean, like I said, tobacco and cotton were not success stories in Barbados. But about this time, about the time of the English Civil War, there were Dutch settlers that were fleeing the Portuguese in Brazil. The Dutch and the English were actually a pretty good fit together. We've talked about that. They were like-minded politically, mostly, and they were conservative Protestants, both groups holding true to the doctrines of the Reformation. And besides, here in Barbados, they both had what the other needed. The Puritans had the money, but no knowledge of the sugar business. And the fleeing Dutch had knowledge of the sugar business, but no money. So the two groups came together, and voila, finally, a crop that would flourish, and sugar became king. As an idea of just how successful sugar would be, Paul Johnson, in his book, A History of the American People, wrote that within a few decades, just after the Restoration in the 1660s, Barbados would become the richest colony in North America, and their exports were more than everybody else's combined. Let that sink in. Barbados was the richest colony in North America, and they exported more than all other colonies combined. That's a success story. So, again, think about this in their time. When the English arrived, Barbados was uninhabited, the 1620s. By the 1660s, less than 40 years later, there were 400 households in Bridgetown alone. I mean, that's the capital. The island boasted 175 big planters, 190 middle-sized, and 1,000 small planters. There were 13,000 additional freemen, 2,300 indentured servants, and 40,000 slaves. The total population was about 55,000. And because of the type of farming that they were engaging in, it was too crowded for the planters. I mean, that was a problem that Charles would alleviate in 1663. And we're going to get to that problem next week. Anyways, how does this tie in with our current main focus of New England? More specifically, the rise of the Puritan political economy in New England. There's one connection in particular that captures my mind and imagination. One particular man. I mean, maybe it's just me, but William Pierce seems to have been a very important individual in the early history of New England. Actually, he held a lot of sway and influence on both sides of the Atlantic as well as the Caribbean. He knew the major players of his day, and they trusted him with their lives, literally. Captain William Pierce was born in 1591 in England, and he arrived in Boston in 1632. He would be a member of the church, a selectman. Records tell us that he owned 100 acres of land. By 1632, he had already made numerous journeys to North America, beginning about a decade earlier in the early 1620s. He brought the first cattle to New England from England. He transported the first load of cotton from the West Indies to New England, and sweet potatoes, too. He's credited with publishing the first book in North America, Pierce's Almanac of 1639. He made the most voyages across the Atlantic of any of the initial merchants and sailors, transporting hundreds of settlers and being a devout Puritan, reading the Bible aloud to his crew every day. He was a friend and a confidant of William Bradford, Edward Winslow, and John Winthrop. I mean, that's quite a group. He was recognized as the most capable seaman available to train the best and the brightest of New England's youth for a life at sea. He was a supporter of the educational system and donated to its cause. You remember we spent a whole episode talking about Puritan education. Although he was not the captain of the famed Mayflower expedition that delivered the Pilgrims, he would go on to lead 9 separate voyages on that legendary ship. Now, there is some controversy about that, but I feel pretty confident that he did captain the actual Mayflower of the Pilgrims' Day. He just wasn't their captain. And I want to be careful when we talk about Captain Pierce for other reasons. There's some controversy over just how many William Pierces there actually were in the colonies during the 1630s. Some argue that there were 3 separate people, and some combined the 3 into one person. But it's difficult to reconcile the 3 different personages named William Pierce with the actual historical records. So, to start, there was another Captain Pierce in New England. But that Captain Pierce was also listed as a 3-time governor of the United Colonies. The United Colonies didn't officially organize until 1643, 2 years after our William Pierce died. So if that's the case, it's unlikely. And some have suggested that the William Pierce that was the governor of the United Colonies may have actually been his son. I don't know. But there was another William Pierce in Virginia who lived an influential life, but his timeline does not appear to line up with our Captain William Pierce. So at any rate, I'm going to go with 3 separate William Pierces. None of the activities or events we talk about with William Pierce would change a whole lot regardless. So at any rate, he was an important guy. Like so many of the men that we've looked at, John Underhill or Governor John Mason. We could even say Roger Williams and Hutchinson, although their series was only 2 episodes each. But we could spend a few episodes on William Pierce. We're not going to, but I do want to read a little bit of his resume and give you kind of a sense of just how important this guy was, how big a role he actually played. Because he's one of these guys, another one of these guys, that's been lost to history a little bit. And I think that's unfortunate. So we have already mentioned a few things, but we can start with some of the activities that really played to his personal strengths. He captained 2 of the original ocean-worthy vessels made in New England, the Rebecca and the Desire. And that would have been quite an honor in those days. That's impressive. But the things that we've mentioned so far, including captaining those 2 vessels, are mere trivia. There are 3 things that are more important to our story and his that I want to talk about. And those are, first of all, a ceremonial arrival. Secondly, a particular maiden voyage that he took. And thirdly, his death, which I hope to demonstrate was a major catalyst, possibly the final solidifying event for Boston's hegemony. So the first event has been coined the first or original Thanksgiving. This is that ceremonial arrival. You see, the winter of 1630 and 1631 was harsh in New England. Massachusetts Bay had just recently been settled. Men like John Winthrop had just recently arrived that summer. Food, even ground nuts and acorns, were scarce. But John Winthrop had foreseen a tough winter. So in the fall of 1630, he had sent William Pierce across the Atlantic to secure more food for the settlers. I mean, that seems like a dangerous time of year to cross the Atlantic in those days. Anyway, Captain Pierce was delayed in his return because he happened upon a vessel, the Ambrose, which had been dismasted at sea. So he towed her to safety back to Bristol before returning. When he arrived, it was just in time. Cotton Mather recorded that William Pierce returned just as John Winthrop was distributing the last of the meal in the barrel. I don't know if that's, folklore or not, but the reality is they were going to run out of food very soon. So the food supply was replenished with plenty of beef and pork and wheat and beans and oatmeal and cheese and butter and suet and lemon juice. And Pierce was a hero, and it was a time for celebration. Many Thanksgiving enthusiasts, like Mary Lowe and W. DeLoss Love Jr., point to this event as the first Thanksgiving. Reason being that on the day that had been set aside for fasting, they held a celebratory day of Thanksgiving instead. Intentionally religious because of Pierce's delivery of the life-saving food. On the Thanksgiving Day of 1621, a decade earlier, which we did talk about many episodes ago, it was a part of a whole week of celebration, but had not been an intentional religious celebration. So for the record, our modern celebration isn't necessarily religious either, is it? At any rate, at the very least, William Pierce saved the day in 1631. At the most, he can be credited with the celebration that we call Thanksgiving today, although the arrival and celebration was in February and not November. That's the ceremonial arrival. The next thing that we want to look at is a particular maiden voyage that he took. Well, there were actually a series of events leading up to it. These events all happened between 1636 and 1637 or 38. The years leading up to and including the Pequot Wars. During these years, he was active in the Caribbean, New England, and London. He was at Block Island in 36, and he delivered supplies from Boston to the English during the War of 1637 with the Pequots. And these activities all led to an infamous voyage of the same year, 1637. Now, if you recall, after the Pequots had been destroyed, many of their surviving men were sent to the Caribbean for slave labor. Well, those that were not absorbed into the Mohegan Nation under Uncas or one of the other tribes. The idea was to remove the most dangerous, potentially rebellious men from the region. And it was Captain William Pierce aboard the ship Desire that transported them to Bermuda to sell as slaves. And Pierce, as we'll soon find out, had an interest in the Caribbean and the West Indies. Like so many Puritans, he had connections and allegiances in both New England and the Southern Island colonies. This turned out to be an expedition of reconnaissance. Pierce realized that the islands represented a potential market for New England products, especially fish and liquor. So he sold his slaves and he picked up a cargo of salt and cotton and tobacco to take back to New England. And along the way, he came in contact with 2 men of war, pirating ships, that had been financed by the Earl of Warwick, Lord Brooke, and Viscount Say and Seal. And again, those same Puritan leaders who funded and founded Saybrook Colony in Connecticut, as well as Providence Island near today's Nicaragua. Well, it's between Costa Rica and Jamaica, but it's actually a part of Colombia. Anyway, although Providence Island was established in 1629 by English Puritans, the colony was actually located in the Spanish Caribbean. Now, those men of war that William Pierce had encountered were targeting Spanish merchant ships, and quite successfully, I might add. And they had acquired African slaves in those pursuits. And Captain Pierce purchased some of these slaves. So along with the cotton, the salt, and the tobacco, he brought slaves to New England. These were the first verified African slaves in New England, and there would be much more to come. Although the type of slavery that developed in the southern colonies never quite materialized in the North, this shipment was the spark that ignited an inferno, and none of the colonies would ever be the same. The final event in the life of Captain William Pierce that I want to talk about is the most important, for a host of reasons, not the least of which is he died. It was perhaps the final event that sealed Massachusetts Bay as well, and more specifically Boston as the Puritan powerhouse, and one of the most influential colonies of the North American colonial era. But that's a story that demands a broader development, even if it's just an outline for now, of how slavery spread to the mainland of the English colonies. It's also a story for next time, and until then, I hope our time together this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.